The sea told me before anyone else did. Not in words, the sea does not use words. It told me the way it tells everything, by pulling, by drawing back, by insisting in the dark hours before dawn that I rise and walk the cliff path to the graveyard on the northern point of the island. I am the Alpha King of Coravel. I have a hall of pale coral stone and a throne carved from a single piece of driftwood the size of a sleeping whale, and I have an entire pack of wolves who would have followed me down that cliff path without question if I had let them. I did not let them. 3 years I have made that walk alone. I told myself I was going to think. A king needs somewhere to think without his council breathing at his back, and the tidal graveyard on Coravel's northern point is the only place on this island where no one follows me. The dead are not ambitious. They ask nothing. They lie beneath their coral stone markers and let the wind have its way with the salt grass above them, and they are, in my experience, the most honest company a king can find. That is what I told myself. What I did not tell myself, what I refused to examine in the way a man refuses to examine a wound he knows will cost him something, was the woman. She was there the first morning I came. I had expected the graveyard to be empty at that hour. The sky was still more black than gray, and the tide was low, pulling back from the base of the cliffs with a sound like breathing. She was kneeling beside a marker near the cliff's edge, her dark cloak spread around her on the wet grass, her hands moving over the coral stone with the slow, deliberate care of someone who has done this 1,000 times. She was relighting the small oil lantern that sat beside the grave. Her hands were steady. The wind off the sea was cold enough that I could see my own breath, and she was there as though cold were something that happened to other people. She did not look up when I came. I stopped. I am not accustomed to being unnoticed. I am a large man. I carry the weight of a king's bearing in the way I stand and the way I move, and the wolves of Coravel have always responded to my presence even when I have tried to make myself quiet. She did not respond. She finished relighting the lantern, cupped her hands around it for a moment as though warming her palms on the small flame, and then she sat back on her heels and looked at the name carved into the coral. She said something. It was low enough that the wind took it before it reached me, and I did not catch the words. She was speaking to the dead, and it did not seem to trouble her that the dead could not answer. My wolf, the inner presence that has lived at my shoulder since the night of my binding, that great gray weight of instinct and loyalty and purpose, went still. Not quiet in the way he goes quiet when I am hunting, not the coiled readiness of a wolf about to move. He went still the way water goes still, like a lake at sunrise when nothing stirs, and the surface is so perfect a mirror that you cannot tell the sky from its reflection. I stood there for a long time. She never looked at me. I went back to my hall when the sky began to lighten. I ate breakfast. I held my morning council and listened to my advisors argue about the Eastern trade routes and the new tariff on coral export, and whether the lighthouse keeper at Varn Point needed to be replaced. I said the right words in the right places, and I gave the right orders. And that evening, when the tide had run back out and the moon was cutting a line across the dark water, I walked the cliff path again. She was there. That was 3 years ago. I never learned her name the ordinary way. I never simply walked up to her in the graveyard and asked. I am ashamed of that now. I told myself it would disturb her work. I told myself a king does not introduce himself in graveyards at dawn like a young man hoping to be noticed. I told myself many things, and none of them were entirely true, and the one true thing I would not say aloud was this. I was afraid that if I spoke to her directly, whatever spell was holding my wolf still would be broken, and I could not afford to lose the only peace I had found in years. I had come to Coravel's kingship through grief. My father died when I was 19, my mother 3 years after. I had a mate in those years, a woman the council approved, a woman of good bloodline and sound bearing, and I had cared for her in the way a king cares for what is his, with duty and attentiveness and the kind of warmth that is carefully managed, never wild. She died in the third winter of our pairing, a fever that came fast and left nothing. I buried her in the southern yard, in the traditional section, with the elder's ceremony and the pack in attendance, and all the correct words spoken over all the correct stones. I had mourned her. I want to be clear about that. I had mourned her the way I did everything, steadily, with my full attention, until I had understood what I had lost and could carry it. But I had never, in all the years of that pairing, felt what I felt the first morning I stood at the edge of the tidal graveyard and watched a woman I did not know speak to the dead while the sea pulled back and my wolf went as still as standing water. I did not know what that meant. I told myself it meant nothing in particular. I told myself a great many things. What I did instead was learn her slowly, the way the sea learns a shore, by returning again and again, until every stone was familiar. Her name I learned from the island's record keeper in what I hoped seemed like a casual inquiry about the graveyard's custodians, was Saren. She had been on the northern point for as long as anyone could clearly remember. Not always. The record showed a gap, a period before her arrival during which the tidal graveyard had been tended by a rotating roster of the pack's younger members, which was unusual. Normally such posts were held long-term. But for the past 11 years, Saren had been the graveyard's keeper. She lived in the small stone house at the top of the cliff path, the one with the blue-painted door and the herb garden on the south-facing wall. She received a modest stipend from the pack's common fund. She had no formal rank. She had no family listed in the records. No family. That was the line that stayed with me. On Corevel, everyone had family listed in the records. The island was small enough and old enough that bloodlines ran through its record books the way roots run through soil, cross-hatching and looping back on themselves, connecting this household to that one, tracing the living back to the names on the coral stone markers. To have no family listed was unusual. It could mean you were an outsider, someone who had come to the island from elsewhere. It could mean you were adopted into a household that had not formally registered the connection. It could mean the records had simply been lost or damaged in one of the bad storms. It could mean something else. I did not pursue it. Not yet. I was, in those early months, still trying to persuade myself that my interest in Saren was mild and impersonal, the natural curiosity of a king about one of his people, and that the fact that my wolf went utterly still every time I walked within sight of her was a coincidence of some kind, or a phenomenon I simply had not encountered before, and that it would resolve itself in time. It did not resolve itself, it deepened. I began to arrive at the graveyard earlier and stay longer. I am not proud of the strategy. It had the embarrassing quality of something a boy of 16 might do. But I told myself I was simply taking my thinking time at the northern point because the view was useful for a king's mind. And eventually, the logic of the situation did the inevitable thing and placed me close enough to speak. The morning it happened was in late autumn, the tide coming in hard with a southwest wind behind it. Saren was relighting the cliff edge markers, the row of small lanterns that lined the path down to the water, which she kept burning from dusk to dawn for any boats that might be coming in past the point. She was working against the wind, curving her body around each lantern as she lit it, and I had stopped on the path above her because the wind had taken the flame from the last one just as she got it lit, and I had watched her do it 3 times without showing any frustration whatsoever. And on the 4th attempt, I came down the path and put my back to the wind without thinking. She looked up at me. Her eyes were dark, the dark of deep water when the sky above it is gray, and her face was entirely composed. Not closed, not wary. Composed the way a person is composed who has spent a long time alone and no longer feels the ordinary anxieties of company, because they have made their peace with solitude so thoroughly that another person's presence is simply weather. Noted, not alarming. "Thank you," she said. She lit the lantern. It held. She moved to the next one and I moved with her without being invited, and that was how the conversation started, not with an introduction, not with a king announcing himself, but with two people working against a wind in the gray, early light of a Coravel morning. I learned a great deal that morning. She knew who I was. She had known since the first morning I came, which meant that every time she had continued her work without acknowledging my presence, it had been a deliberate choice, not rudeness, but respect of a particular kind. The understanding that a king walking alone to a graveyard before dawn is a king who needs to be left alone. She had simply given me that without being asked. She had been giving it to me for months. I felt something move in my chest at that, something I did not have a clean name for. She did not ask me why I came to the graveyard. She asked nothing of me at all. When I asked her how long she had been keeping the northern point, she said 11 years, and when I asked if she had come from elsewhere on the island or from somewhere further, she was quiet for a moment before she said, gently, that she was not entirely sure. I did not push the question. The wind was dropping, and the last lantern was lit, and she was gathering her supplies with the unhurried efficiency of someone at home in her own work, and I found that I did not want to say anything that might change the quality of the morning. "I will come back tomorrow," I said. It came out more simply than I had intended. Not a king's announcement, but a plain statement, like something a man says when he intends to keep a promise. She looked at me for a moment, and something moved in her face that I could not quite name, not surprise, not pleasure exactly. Recognition, perhaps. The way a person looks when they have been waiting for something for a very long time without quite knowing they were waiting. "The lanterns need relighting every morning," she said. "I'm glad of the help with the wind." There are things a king learns to read. 20 years of governance teaches you to watch the room rather than the argument, to notice the thing that is not being said, to measure the distance between a man's words and his intent. I was good at this. It was, my counsel informed me, the quality that made my judgment sound even when the law was unclear. I began to apply it to Saren, and what I read there troubled me. She was not simply quiet. She was quiet in the specific way of someone who has learned that asking questions about herself leads nowhere useful, who has made, at some point, a decision to live entirely in the present tense and not reach back into whatever lay behind the blank space in the island's records. She was not frightened of that blank space. She was more at peace with it than I would have expected a person to be. It was as though she had set the question down a long time ago and walked away from it. But there were moments. When the tide was very low and the sea pulled far back from the base of the cliffs, exposing the old coral shelves that lay under the waterline most of the year, she would stand at the cliff edge and look down at them with an expression I can only describe as listening, as though the old stone was trying to tell her something she almost understood. And once, only once, in the second winter of my coming to the northern point, I saw her press her palm flat against one of the oldest grave markers in the graveyard, one of the coral stone pillars from the time before the current record-keeping, and I saw the stone react to her hand. A faint warmth, a faint luminescence, the kind that the oldest pack-bonded stones carry when they recognize bloodline. She pulled her hand back quickly as though it had startled her, and when she looked up and saw me watching, she said quietly, "They do that sometimes. The old ones. I don't know why." I said nothing, but I knew what she did not know she was telling me. The old stones of Coravel respond only to the pack's bound bloodline. They were set during the founding, when the first Alpha King of Coravel pressed his lineage into the coral itself, and they have carried that recognition ever since. They warm to his descendants. They warm to the bonded females of the line. They do not warm to strangers. I went back to my hall that evening and I sat for a long time in front of the fire, and I said to my wolf, "What is she?" And my wolf, who had been still as standing water for 2 years and 3 months and some number of days, looked at me from behind my ribs and said nothing at all. But the stillness was not absence. It was the stillness of a thing known, a thing settled, a thing that had been waiting patiently for me to catch up. The elder's name was Thavan. He had served 3 kings of Coravel as a succession council member, which made him very old and very trusted, and as it turned out, very afraid. He came to me in the deep of a winter night, alone, without the protocol that attendance at the king's rooms required, which told me before he spoke a single word that whatever he carried was not something he could say in the presence of witnesses. My night guard admitted him because I had given standing orders that Thavan was to be admitted at any hour. He had been my father's most steadfast counselor, and I had always trusted him. He did not look trustworthy that night. He looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and had reached the point where the weight of it was greater than his fear of setting it down. "My lord," he said, and stopped. I waited. I have learned that silence is often the most useful thing a king can offer. "The woman at the northern point," he said, "the gravekeeper." I kept my face still. "Saren." "Yes." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were wet. Thavan had not wept in my presence in 20 years of counsel, and the sight of it was alarming in a very specific way, not the alarm of danger but the alarm of something long buried moving toward the surface. "My lord, I have to tell you something about the succession, 12 years ago, about the month after your mate died." My wolf had been still for more than 2 years. In that moment he moved, not rising, not surging, but turning, the way a wolf turns in its sleep when a sound it has been waiting for finally comes. "Tell me," I said. It took Thavan most of an hour. The succession council, in the months after my first mate's death, had determined that I would take a second mate within the year. This was their right under Coravel's founding law. The pack's continuity required it, and I had not contested it, though I had been, in those months, still deep in the managed steadiness of grief and not particularly interested in anyone's continuity requirements. The council had identified 3 candidates. The process of selection had begun. There had been a 4th. She had not been identified as a candidate by the council. She had been identified by Coravel itself, by the old stones, by the pack's founding marks that were set into the coral of the hall's deepest walls. When the succession process was opened, those marks had done something they had not done in 4 generations. They had responded to a woman in the pack's outer settlement. Not a noblewoman, not a council family's daughter. A quiet young woman of no particular standing who worked as a dye tender in the coastal workshops. The marks had burned when she walked through the hall's outer gate. The succession council had panicked, not because she was unsuitable. The marks do not warm to unsuitable mates. Their accuracy is absolute. They panicked because she was unsuitable to them. She was young and without influence and entirely outside the network of alliances and obligations that the council had been carefully weaving for 20 years. She carried no political advantage. She had no family connections that served the council's purposes. Her becoming Luna would have dismantled everything the council had spent 2 decades constructing. What they did, I cannot set down in my mind cleanly even now, without a cold rage that I have to deliberately hold still. They told her the marks had made an error, a technical malfunction, a misread of bloodline that sometimes happened with young women who had old pack ancestry. They told her she needed to be examined by the pack's founding stone keeper to verify the reading. They brought her to the tidal crypt at the base of the northern cliff, the oldest sealed chamber in Coravel, a place used in the founding era for ceremonial binding, unused for a century. They sealed the door. They went back to the hall and declared that the 4th candidate had been found unsuitable and had been dismissed from the island's records pending a confidentiality review. She had been 18 years old. She had been in that crypt not fully sealed. There was a tidal vent that brought air in from the sea face of the cliff for 6 days before a fisherman's daughter, checking crab pots at the base of the cliff at low tide, heard her voice through the vent and raised the alarm. They brought her out. She was alive. She did not know clearly where she had been or for how long. The crypt's particular quality, something in the old coral stone, some property the founders had built into it for reasons no longer fully understood, had acted on her memory the way deep cold acts on water, not destroying it, but suspending it, holding it in a state between knowledge and forgetting. The council had reached her before anyone could talk to her fully. They had told her the island had no record of her. They had given her the house on the northern point and the gravekeeper's stipend and the instruction framed as guidance, but she had been 18 and frightened and had no one to contradict it, that she should stay at the northern point and not press the question of her past. The island's records had been quietly revised. For 11 years, she had tended the graves of the dead and lived in the house with the blue door and pressed her hands against the old coral stones that warmed to her touch and not understood why. Thavan finished speaking and looked at me with the eyes of a man who knows he is broken and is past caring about it. 3 members of the council arranged it, he said. Marit, Savin, Selm, I said nothing. I was given to understand that my family's position on Corevel depended on my silence. He paused. Your father's position also depended on my silence for a time. He did not know. My lord, I believe you did not know. I need to believe that. I did not know, I said. My voice was very steady. I am a king. I have learned to keep my voice steady when everything else is not. Go to your rooms, Thavan. Do not speak to anyone. I will come for you in the morning. He went. I sat for a moment more in front of the fire. Then I got up and I walked to the northern point in the dark. The night was clear, the kind of winter clear that comes when the wind has scoured the sky down to its bones and left nothing but stars and the smell of cold salt. The tide was out, very far out, the kind of extreme low tide that comes only a few times a year, when the sea pulls back further than usual and exposes stone that normally lies underwater. I could hear it at the base of the cliff, that distant slow sound of retreat. The light in the house with the blue door was burning. It was past midnight. I did not know whether Saren kept late hours or whether something had woken her, but I stood at the gate of the small herb garden for a long moment, and then I knocked. She opened the door quickly, as though she had heard me on the path. She was in her night cloak, a dark wool thing that fell to her ankles, and she had a candle in her hand. Her face, when she saw me, shifted, not to alarm, not to the particular expression people put on when the Alpha King arrives unexpectedly at their door. She looked, very briefly, as though something she had been sitting with for a long time had finally announced itself. You know, she said, it was not a question. Some of it, I said. Tell me what you know. She stood back and let me in. She made tea because her hands needed something to do, and I let her, and we sat at her small table with the winter sea audible through the stone walls, and she told me what she knew, which was less than I had feared and more than I had hoped. She knew she had no past before the northern point. She knew the records held nothing of her family. She had made her peace with that in the way she made her peace with everything, by deciding, at some point, that the uncertainty was not going to be resolved by wanting it to be otherwise, and that a life could be built in the present even when the past was sealed. She knew the old stones warmed to her. She had never spoken of it to anyone because it had seemed like the kind of thing that might cause trouble, and trouble was not something she sought. She had been living on this island for 11 years, making herself as quiet and undemanding as possible, and I understood now, hearing her say it with that same gentle composure that had drawn me to her in the first place, that the composure was not natural ease. It was something she had made, carefully and deliberately, out of the only materials available to her, which were the island's salt air and the dead she tended, and the small, honest work of keeping the lanterns burning. There is a crypt, I said, at the base of the northern cliff, the old founding chamber. Do you know it? Something changed in her face, very small. The candle between us made it visible even in that slight a shift. I know where it is, she said. I have never gone near it. I don't know why. She paused. No. I do know why. Something about it. She stopped, tried again. It feels like a place that already knows me, and I have found on this island that places that already know me tend to lead somewhere I am not yet ready to go. Are you ready now? I asked. She looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were the dark of deep water, and what was in them was not fear. It was the expression of someone who has been waiting for a particular question for 11 years. Yes, she said. We went down the cliff path together, carrying her lantern between us. The extreme low tide had left the base of the cliff fully exposed, slick black rock and coral shelf, and set into the cliff face where it was normally hidden by the water line, a sealed door of old coral stone. The door had a mark cut into its face, the founding mark of Coravel, the same mark that was on the walls of my hall's deepest chamber, the same mark that had warmed to her 11 years ago. She stopped when she saw it. I felt her go still beside me, not frightened, but inward, the way a person goes inward when they are trying to hear something very faint. Go ahead, I said. She reached out and pressed her palm against the door. The coral lit, not the faint warmth I had seen on the grave markers. This was the full response of a founding stone meeting its recognized blood, a deep rose-gold luminescence spreading outward from her handprint through the old stone's entire face. I had seen it happen once before, when my own father had pressed his hand against the founding wall to show me what the stone would do for bloodline. It had looked exactly like this. The mate mark appeared on her wrist. I had heard of it. Every Alpha King of Coravel knew the stories, the mark of the fated bond, the destined pairing, the thing the old stones had been waiting 12 years to confirm. I had not expected to see it. I had not, if I am honest, quite believed it still happened. It rose slowly on the inside of her left wrist, a coral pale sigil that shifted between the paleness of living bone and the deep rose of the founding luminescence. And Saren looked at it with an expression I cannot entirely describe, not shock, not joy, not grief. Something quieter than all of those. Recognition, the expression of someone who has found, at last, the thing that explains the blank space. She looked at me. I held up my right wrist. The answering mark was there, where it had not been an hour ago. We stood in the salt dark at the base of the cliff with the sea far out, and the founding stone still lit between us, and neither of us spoke for a long moment. I was in there, she said, very quietly, not a question. Yes. How long? 6 days, you were brought out, but I stopped. Some truths need to be given carefully. Your memory of what had happened was affected by the stone. You didn't know clearly what you had been through, and the people responsible used that. She nodded, slowly, processing it with the same unhurried steadiness she brought to everything. The council. 3 of them, yes. She looked at the founding door a moment longer. Then she looked at me. You've been coming to the graveyard for 3 years. Yes. You didn't know. Not until tonight, but I wanted to say this correctly. My wolf knew from the first morning. He went still when he saw you. He has been still ever since. Something moved in her face at that, warm and very quiet. I know, she said. I felt it. I didn't know what it was. I thought it was the island knowing something I didn't. She paused. I suppose that is what it was in a way. I reached out, slowly enough that she could step back if she wished, and I took her hand. Her fingers were cold from the sea air and steady. The mate marks on our wrists were touching, and where they touched the warmth moved between them in a way that felt like the closing of something that had been open too long. We need to go back to the hall, I said. There are things that need to be done before morning. The 3 council members, she said. Yes. And the others who kept silence. I looked at her. You are clear-minded about it. I am angry, she said, with the same gentle composure she used for everything, which somehow made the anger more considerable, not less. I am very angry, and I have been tending the graves of people who were allowed to die honestly, and I think being brought out in the open is the least of what is owed. She met my eyes. but that is your work. I'll tell you what I know, and you'll do it as the law requires. That seems right." I nodded. "That is right." She looked at the founding door one more time. Then she blew out the lantern, not dramatically, simply practically, because the coral glow was giving enough light and she did not like to waste oil, and she picked up her cloak and she said, "All right, let's go up." We went up the cliff path together. Above us, the stars were still. What I did in the hours before dawn, I will not fully record here, because the law of Corhevel covers it, and the law does not require embellishment. I woke 3 counselors, Marit, Savin, and Selm, and I told them what I knew, and I told them what Thavin had confessed, and I told them that the founding stone had answered Saren's hand, which was evidence of a kind that could not be argued. I watched them understand that the thing they had buried had come back up. Marit said it had been done for the pack's stability. Savin said the marks could be misread. Selm said nothing. He simply put his face in his hands. I said that the law of Corhevel on falsification of succession records, on deliberate harm to a pack member, and on conspiracy against the founding bond was clear, and that they would appear before the full council in the morning, and that I would be applying it. By the time the sky was beginning to lighten toward gray, the messenger had gone to every elder on the island with instruction to present at the Coral Hall by mid-morning. I had woken my own steward and my own pack keeper and the record keeper, and told them what was coming. Thavin, I had confirmed, would be present to give his full testimony. I had told him also that his years of silence had consequences, but that the fact of his testimony, given voluntarily and completely, would be weighed in the law's balance along with everything else. He had wept again. I let him. Saren I had settled in the hall's smaller receiving room with the fire going and someone to bring her food, and I had gone in to see her before I began the council work. She was sitting beside the fire with her hands around a bowl of something warm, and she looked, I want to be honest about this, like someone who has been in a long winter and can feel, for the first time, that the season is changing. Not happy in the simple sense, something more serious than happiness. The satisfaction of a person whose wait has ended. "How are you?" I asked. "Tired," she said, angry still but clear. She looked at me. "You have a great deal to do this morning." "Yes." "Go do it." I almost smiled. "You will be here." She looked briefly around the room, at the coral stone walls and the fire, and the light coming in through the salt-hazed window. "I have been tending the graves of Corhevel's dead for 11 years, she said. "I am not going to leave Corhevel now. I want to do the work." The full council assembled in the Coral Hall by mid-morning, as I had ordered. The island's elders, the pack representatives, the sub-alphas of the 4 coastal settlements, 73 people in a hall built to hold 200, the coral stone lit by the long south-facing windows in the winter light. Thavin gave his testimony in full. It took a long time. The hall was very quiet through most of it. The particular quality of the quiet was different from the polite quiet of an ordinary council session. It was the quiet of people who are re-understanding what they have been living inside. I presented the evidence of the founding stone. I had brought the graveyard's record keeper to the crypt door at first light to witness the stone's response, and he stood before the council and confirmed what he had seen. The full founding luminescence, the mark rising on her wrist, the answering mark on mine. I presented the 3 counselors and their actions, with Thavin's account and the record keeper's witness, and the founding stone's evidence as the basis. Marit made an argument that lasted about 4 minutes before I stopped it. Savin attempted to speak about precedent. Selm was simply silent, and that silence was, in its own way, its own kind of testimony. The law of Corhevel gave the verdict. I was the instrument. Marit, Savin, and Selm were removed from council, stripped of their positions, and would be brought before the full law before the season turned. Thavin was censured, his voluntary testimony registered as the mitigating element the law allowed. The records were to be corrected, Saren's full record restored, the false confidentiality order struck, every trace of what had been done to her put back as it should be. When the formal business was done, I stood before the council and I said, "The founding stone has confirmed the fated bond. The woman known on the northern point as Saren is the Pax Luna bonded. This is not a decision I am making. It is a fact the stone has registered. The ceremony of acknowledgement will take place on the shore at the south gate at the turn of the tide this afternoon, and I expect the pack in attendance." No one argued. I did not expect anyone to. She had not asked for ceremony. When I told her in the receiving room what the afternoon held, she looked at me with a particular expression, not displeasure, but a kind of gentle skepticism, as though ceremony were a well-intentioned practice she personally found slightly overblown. "I would rather just," she began. "I know," I said, "but the pack needs to see. What was done to you was done in front of the pack's silence, even if most of them did not know it directly. The acknowledgement needs to be public." I paused. 11 years, Saren. The pack has 11 years of you tending their dead and carrying their lanterns and asking nothing. They should see who you are. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "All right. You don't need to wear anything different. You don't need to do anything different. You just need to stand on the shore and let them see you." She looked down at her hands. The mate mark was still visible on her wrist, pale coral against her skin, steady. "I'll wear my good cloak," she said. "The blue one." The blue one, I discovered when we came out onto the south shore in the afternoon, was a deep blue-gray, the color of the sea before rain, and she wore it with the same unhurried composure with which she did everything. And she stood beside me on the coral stone platform at the water's edge, with the winter sea behind her and the tide coming in, and the 70-odd members of my immediate pack assembled on the shore. I put my cloak over her shoulders. It was the kingship's cloak, the heavy charcoal gray wool with the founding mark stitched in rose gold thread at the collar, and it was large on her, and she did not protest it. I said the words of acknowledgement. They are old words, very simple from the founding law, and they do not require much ornamentation. I said them, and I meant everyone. Then I turned and I faced the pack and I said, "She has kept your dead. She has lit your lanterns. She has asked nothing, and you did not know to ask anything on her behalf. The founding stone has known her for 11 years. Now you know." The elders knelt first. It was not something I had instructed them to do. It was what the founding law said you did when the Alpha's bonded mate was acknowledged in the presence of the founding bond's evidence. The sub-alphas followed. Then the pack representatives. Then, in the particular rolling way of a large body of people moving as one thing rather than many, the whole shore. I have seen the pack kneel before. I have never seen them kneel with that specific quality of feeling, not formality, not protocol. Something older than those. The recognition of something that had been wrong for a long time and was now, at last, right. Saren stood beside me and looked out at the assembled shore and did not speak. I watched her face. She was not triumphant. She was not, I think, someone for whom that particular emotion came easily. What was on her face was something I thought I recognized, though I had seen it in her before only in small moments, at the graveyard in the early mornings when the tide was out and the light was right, and she was between the markers with her hands doing their careful work. It was the expression of a person who has found, at last, the place they were always meant to be. The season turned, the winter eased. The law's work regarding the 3 council members moved through its proper course, slowly and thoroughly, as Coravel's law did everything. Saren continued to tend the northern graveyard. I want to be clear about that because it seems important. She did not give it up. She had built something there in 11 years, a practice, a relationship with the dead of Coravel that was specific and real and hers, and she was not inclined to set it down simply because her circumstances had changed. She tended the graves on the mornings I did not come with her, and she tended them on the mornings I did. And on the mornings I came, we worked side by side as we had for 3 years, relighting lanterns against the wind and replacing weathered markers and sitting in the salt silence with the sea below us. She moved into the hall at the south gate slowly and in her own time, bringing the things from the house with the blue door piece by piece, keeping the herb garden on the south-facing wall in case whoever came after her would find it useful. She did not bring everything at once. She was not a person who moved fast when careful was available. She asked a great many questions. Once she was settled, sharp questions, careful questions, the questions of someone who had spent 11 years watching how a community worked from the outside and now wanted to understand it from the inside. She asked about the pack's history and the law's foundations, and the founding stone's properties and the eastern trade routes and the lighthouse keeper at Varn Point, and whether he had in fact been replaced. She asked about the families of the people buried at the northern point, because she knew things about the dead that their families might want to know and had had no way to tell them before. She asked about Thaven's family and what was happening to them under the censure. She was, I began to understand, someone who had been paying very close attention for 11 years with no outlet for any of it, and she was now paying very close attention with an outlet, and the effect was both energizing and slightly humbling. My council, which was being reconstituted after the removals, adapted to her fairly quickly. She never demanded anything. She simply asked questions and waited for the answers and followed the reasoning wherever it led, and the quality of her attention was such that the council members began, within a few months, to look at her when they were presenting something they were uncertain about, the way you look at someone whose judgment you have learned to trust. One evening in the early spring, when the days were beginning to lengthen and the sea was starting to change its quality from winter gray to the particular blue-green that Coravel wears between equinox and midsummer, we sat on the cliff top south of the graveyard and watched the sun go into the sea. She had her lantern with her out of habit, though it was not yet dark enough to need it. I had a coat over us, both because the wind was still cold. I used to wonder, she said, whether I had been unhappy here in the 11 years, before you told me what had happened. Were you? She considered it seriously, which was how she considered everything. No, she said at last, not unhappy. I was complete in myself as much as I could be, and I had the dead who were honest company, and I had the sea, a pause, and for 3 years I had you at a distance. That is perhaps the most generous description of my behavior in those 3 years that anyone has offered, I said. She looked at me sideways. The warmth in it was very quiet and very particular. You came back every morning for 3 years, she said. You stood at the edge of what you didn't understand, and you didn't run from it, and you didn't force it. That seems to me like the right thing. My wolf knew, I said. I was catching up. You caught up, she said. That's what matters. The sun went into the sea. The lantern she was carrying cast a small, warm circle of light around us both on the coral stone. Below the cliff, the tide was coming in, covering the founding door and the tidal crypt and the old sealed bone of the island's history with the patient, indifferent water that covered everything eventually. I put my hand over hers, where it rested on the lantern's base. The mate marks touched, and the warmth moved between them as it always did, steady, unhurried, the way the things that are made to be feel when they are in the place they were made for. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The sea came in. The lantern burned. Above us, the first star opened in the darkening sky, and the wind off the water carried salt and the smell of spring, and on the northern point the graves of Coravel's dead lay in their orderly rows, tended and remembered, their lanterns lit against whatever dark was coming. She had kept them for 11 years. She would keep them for as long as the tide ran, and I would walk beside her, and that was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole of it, the everything that the founding stone had known before either of us did, burning patient and certain in the coral of Coravel's bones.